Just a few words. Some of our panelists cannot stay for the entire session, so if they all of a sudden jump off the stage, it is not because they're leaving in a huff, but it's because they have elsewhere to go. To my immediate right is Carl Skelton, who roped me into this back in August, I think. Yeah, and Sharon Kanak, who is the co-coordinator of all of these things going on here and has done a wonderful book about Xenakis and has a series of ongoing books about Xenakis, but there's a new one, so we want you to pay attention to the new one. And actually, we want you to pay attention to all of them. And Carrie Lovelace, who has coordinated fascinating exhibition of Xenakis's drawings at the Drawing Center. I mean, what's so fascinating about Xenakis is that he blurs the line between somebody who is a sound-based artist and a visual-based artist in a very unique way, and in a way that I think is a model. And what we're going to be trying to talk about in this group is what the future is. He physically is no longer with us, but his ideas are very much with us. And it's about preserving those ideas, preserving his work, and then taking the ideas that he set up and creating new work with it. And we have Jim Harley here as well, who's also written a book on Xenakis. We have David Lieberman. Is he? Oh, you're just hanging out. Okay. You're hanging out to cause architectural trouble, is what I heard. Architectural trouble. And we'll talk about what that might mean. And we have R. Luc Dubois and Paul D. Miller, who represent two very different composers who, in some ways, I think are very, very indebted to Xenakis and have done very different things following his paths, in some cases actually using his music, and in some cases just using his ideas. But to start it all off, I thought we'd talk a little bit, since Carrie is going to need to leave soon. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this exhibition, because even though this is the final panel, that exhibition is still going on. So if you haven't seen it yet, you still can. So now for the commercial.
So, yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be here and to be here with my co-curator, Sharon Kanak, the genius of many of the events that have been going on here. And, basically, I don't know how many of you have seen the exhibit, but it's at the Drawing Center in Soho. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the right proximity to my microphone, which is on Worcester Street between Grand and Broome, and it's going to be going on through April, so through April 8th, and I think I think the thing that's been so interesting for me, I think this exhibit, to begin with, was actually kind of the springboard for a lot of these events that are going on now. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the origin of the show too. I mean, just to scroll back a little bit, the Drawing Center is kind of a very interesting space. It's sort of a quasi-museum space, and it has a kind of a history as a downtown kind of quasi-museum, and its emphasis is works on paper, but it does like really fascinating shows, and it was really thrilling to be able to do this show there. I actually, Sharon and I actually met because we were both students in Xenakis' class at the Sorbonne that you were hearing about earlier in Paris. So it was interesting to hear about him as a teacher, because I remember him standing at the blackboard kind of scribbling things, it was definitely over my head, but it was, kind of this ongoing conversation. You just felt like you were in the middle of this ongoing conversation that he was having about his music, and he was such an interesting man, because he was very unassuming in a certain way and kind of humble, and he just had his ideas and he would just be kind of laying them out, and in a way I didn't have a really clear idea what he was talking about, but it was still incredibly inspiring, and I think particularly visually, from a visual aspect, because a lot of the things that he would do, even though there was a mathematical basis to them, had a very visual component. And Sharon and I was at that time, I'm now a critic and curator, but at that time I was an avant-garde composer, and I had gone to school at California Institute of the Arts and gotten a degree in music composition and ethnomusicology. And I'd met Sharon, who was sort of a child prodigy at that time, studying with Nadia Boulanger, and we became friends in this class. And through the
we met at Darmstadt.
Yeah, yes, but we won't go through that.
No, but I mean, it's funny in relation to Xenakis because it was originally kind of terre interdite, forbidden land for Xenakis to be in Darmstadt after early performances of his music, and then afterwards he was welcomed back, and a lot of his career was based in Germany or was encouraged by commissions from Germany, and he wasn't actually in Darmstadt that year. We had Ligeti, we had Nono and Stockhausen. And then we met by accident. Charles Michel, there was Carrie sitting in the class the day I came.
Wow.
So we hadn't really planned the career collisions or coincidences, but that's how it started at the end of the 70s.
I never give the date, actually.
Anyway, no, I learned something the other day from Carrie. We were doing a radio interview for, what's it called?
Air America. It's called Air America. It's a brand. It's what used to be affiliated with PS1. Used to be WPS1, but it now is independent. And you can actually you will be able to access this interview online.
And in the course of that interview, I learned something that I didn't know about Carrie, because we kind of divvied up the responsibilities in all of the public programming and also a lot of the exhibit. Also, I keep telling Carrie she's the eyes, I'm the ears. But we do sort of collaborate, I think, very well together, actually, in sharing the responsibilities both ways. Because Carrie has a hell of a set of ears, and I was furious with her when she stopped writing music. But that's another story. But when we were discussing about what we got out of Yannis's class, that same class at the end of the 70s in Paris, I was remembering that if I look at my notebooks from that period now, it's full of sort of philosophical musings, black and white drawings, and things like that. And Carrie remembers her notes and says they were full of color, that you were working with design. So it's funny how Yannis's ideas that he was presenting to us, that were going over our heads, perhaps from a mathematical point of view, developed into something that we both ended up doing a lot of, words with the books with Yannis, and a lot of black and white illustrations, music, and black and white drawings, and Carrie furthering her career in the art world with color and shapes.
Although I write about art, although I don't make art. But I think that was. One time I was speaking to somebody about Xenakis, and they were talking about one of his contributions, that being the kind of transferal of sort of graphic conception into music. And I thought that was very interesting, because I think for me, in particular, when I was a composer, I was kind of working a lot with the graphic form as a kind of metaphor to conceptualize sound and composition. And I think that, now that I've spent a lot of time with Xenakis' work from the point of view of putting together this exhibit, I can see how profoundly he really was a pioneer in that kind of, although not the only one, obviously, but in terms of using form as a kind of a device. But just to scroll forward, because I don't want to hog the whole time. But basically, the origin of this exhibit was that Sharon and I have kept in touch over many, many years, and we were sitting in a restaurant one day a few years back, and Sharon had begun to be the curator of Xenakis' papers that are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale. I don't know how to pronounce it.
The inventory process needed to be done, and Benoit Gibson, who is here also, and Meki Sodomos and I were kind of assigned to do a preliminary inventory of the 80 to 100 moving boxes full of papers.
And I believe we were talking about this, and Sharon was talking about the visual component. I was trying to remember what gave us the spark, but she was talking about the amazing materials that were in these boxes in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, And I just said, well, let's do an exhibit, because it sort of brought together our two abilities. Because in the meantime, I had become a art critic and curator, and I was in the visual world. So we started to conceptualize, like, doing a show. What would that mean? And it seemed like it's something that, like, a small thing we might do in a university gallery or something like that. But we happened to run into Brett Littman, who's the current director of the Drawing Center, which was kind of, if I had picked my, ideal place to do the show, that would have been the ideal place. And I just mentioned that I was going to Paris to look at the archives with Sharon, and I think he didn't even know why I was going, but he said, "Oh my God, that's exactly what we want to do at the Drawing Center," because it turned out that that image that Roger Reynolds showed earlier of that piece with the kites at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, that was done in the 90s when Roger Reynolds invited Xenakis to come as a visiting professor. Well, Brett had been at that piece, and it had been one of those formative experiences for him. So it had meant an incredible amount to him. So he became very involved right away and very passionate about putting this show together. And then as we developed the show, this sort of public programming component began to enter in, and he was very enthusiastically involved in that as well. But I think, the thing that's been so amazing about doing that show, or challenging also, is, I was aware that for people in my world, the art world, not that many people are aware really of Yanis Xenakis. I mean, in my experience, when I was a student, he was a huge deal. But I think the art world, which was very linked with the music world at one point, I think particularly when John Cage was alive, and there was a sort of exchange between visual artists and sound artists, I think that the two worlds have really separated, and at this point, almost nobody knows. Well, 4 out of 5 people will not have the slightest idea in the art world who Xenakis is. 1 out of 5 people will say, "Oh my God," it was sort of like Brett, "I heard his music in, Berlin in 1945 or in 1965, and it was the most amazing thing," So you've got this sort of mixture of people, and the thing that I thought was so interesting with Xenakis, knowing a little bit about him as a composer, was, I thought, this is something that people will be very excited to learn about, that there's such a reservoir of things for people to learn. So I knew that it would spark a lot of interest, and indeed, it has been really well received. But I think the thing that was interesting for me in putting together the show is the many dimensions that are there, almost this is why I'm going on and on like this. There's so many dimensions of his work that I had no concept of. I'd never realized the degree to which he's so important in the world of architecture. And also, just as you're plumbing his work, there's, it's like an endless, it's like a labyrinth of more and more, the ideas that are more and more profound. And that's the thing that I really appreciate about him, and I think that people in the art world will also appreciate.
I want to take off as a jumping point what you were saying about the music coming out of the graphic representation. I actually think it's more fluid than that, because the architectural images and the drawings are coming out of music. It's a complete integration of these two ideas, and something that I've been hearing from a lot of people here, I got here rather late in the process of this weekend, is the whole question of the integration of disciplines versus the gulf between the disciplines. And, it's interesting that you say 4 out of 5 people in the visual art world don't know who Xenakis is, and it might very well be that 4 out of 5 people in the music world aren't aware that Xenakis was an architect. I mean, which is kind of staggering. Now that it's become repertoire, and we have these string quartets and orchestral pieces and percussion work, he's become an icon for different kinds of ensembles who know that aspect of his work, but maybe not the totality of his work. And I'd like to turn this over to Luke, because you're a guy, from my vantage point, for whom when you create a visual-based work or when you create a sound-based work, it's coming out of the same ideas, and it's Xenakian in that sense, if I could posit that.
Yeah, okay, I'd agree with you on that, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that, I sort of mentioned this in my talk a little bit, but the thing that makes Xenakis a useful artistic role model is precisely what you were saying, that he had arts practice that was full spectrum rather than multiple independent arts practices. And that's like the sort of, for me anyway, that's always been the most compelling thing about him, regardless of my personal aesthetic reaction to any of his work. I always thought the thing I really always admired about the guy was that he wasn't, kind of dabbling in multiple things. He actually created like a sort of amazing through line of conceptual work through all this stuff. And one of the things that I always felt engaged with about him, about his work, was that, it's like basically the conceit that, if it's a good idea, it can be expressed in any medium, right? And so, in sort of anti-McLuhan, but he wouldn't have even thought of it that way. But it's the idea that you can basically take these ideas about math or these ideas about form, and you can draw them, you can build them, you can make music out of them. It's all going to work because if the idea is sound, it will sort of work. I have a slightly different spin on it because I always try to find a sort of like metaphorical venue for expression that's fairly specific. Like some things I make like have to be visual because they don't make any sense as sound. But I'm in a different kind of space with how I'm making stuff. But that's the thing I always thought about him that was really kind of impressive and that I always wished I could sort of emulate. Absolutely.
Yeah. And for Paul, the idea of creating completely new building blocks or taking pre-existing building blocks and doing something new with them, the whole notion of sample-based art. Xenakis certainly wasn't the first person to develop musique concrète, but he was perhaps one of the earliest people working in musique concrète who wasn't necessarily about hiding what the sound came from, but actually having it be that you could actually hear the origin of what that sound is, and in a sense is the ancestor of hip-hop and sample-based music in that regard.
One of the things that really inspired my investigation into Xenakis is to look at the arc of the 20th century. You really have to imagine how there was an incredible tension between repetition and dissonance. So if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, a composer like Busoni, who wrote this great essay about ocean of sound. The idea of amplified sound was very scary for a European kind of aesthetic. And I remember when John Cage, who's also a big inspiration for my work, he wrote one of the first compositions for turntables in 1939. And the audience, it was called Imaginary Landscape, and the audience went into a room much like this. And, there was just some turntables playing to one another, frequencies. And the audience was really pissed off, But if you go back even further into this kind of archaeology, which I think Xenakis is very historical-minded. That's something, like he's about archaeology, he's about digging into specific scenarios and activating them. You can think of the sort of equilibrium between repetition and dissonance that like someone like Stravinsky would navigate. Or if you compare it to, there's other, for lack of a better word, I really like to think of him as omnivorous. But the main key here, especially if we're looking at graphic notation and design, is looking at how you have this graphic user interface. That's everything that you've been seeing today is about activating icons on a screen, whether they be software-based or numeric-based and so on. You got to remember back in the day, they did not have this kind of stuff. So trying to figure out an algorithmic process, trying to create a graphic design and a graphic notation system, that's back really early Greek. If you go to Pythagoras and so on. So to make a long story short, 21st century-wise, we've now absorbed all of that. In fact, most kids, there's a kind of unconscious mathematics where kids are playing with video games, ringtones, you name it. But all of that is algorithm-derived music at this point, everything. So hip-hop-wise, it's kind of funny because when we ended up presenting a piece called Chronarch, which I had Charles Bornstein, and it was with Asphodel Records, which is a great experimental record label. We presented it in 1996 or 97. It was one of the first times Xenakis had really encountered a receptive American audience, or at least as far as we'd read. So we were uncertain about how to present it and in which context. So essentially the idea was to DJ this orchestra. So you have a duel between tape loops and orchestra. And if you go back to this early and mid-90s, a lot of this stuff, The uneasy tension between new music and hip hop is still there. There's the hip hop police who are very purist, and you have the new music people who are very purist, and trying to do something hybrid. Again, is very, I think, Xenakian. Kind of looking at these issues. Right now, we all take it for granted. But again, in the ancient mid-'90s, when you think about how far we've come along, and just I can't believe it's 2010. You wake up. But the computational power has gotten much more complex. The density of software has gotten much more complex. And he's still very resonant with that. So, yeah, when I look at from the idea of sampling, it's essentially about a collapse between genre distinctions. And when you can take any material, juxtapose it with anything else, that's a kind of freedom that I think Xenakis would probably celebrate.
Now, I'd like to ask Jim, as an authority on Xenakis and his life and his legacy, really just in terms of how do we protect this legacy? On the one hand, we have all these ideas floating around that he set in motion, but then we also have this amazing body of work, which has very specific performance practices. How do we get new groups involved with doing his work as he envisioned or inhered it, as it were, and then be able to do new things with it as well. It's amazing. It's so exciting. This is the first Xenakis convening that's based in America, the biggest ever in America. And so many now, there are American ensembles who are among the greatest champions of Xenakis, the Jack Quartet, who did this extraordinary recording of the string quartets that came out on Mode last year. ICE, the International Contemporary Ensemble, that did the staggeringly good performance of Oresteia at Miller Theater a couple of seasons back. So, yeah, last year. Wow, it feels last decade, right? It was last year. It was last decade.
It was that awesome.
Yeah, how do we balance those two things, and what are the performance practices that Xenakis would have wanted for his work?
It's a really interesting question, and we were talking about this earlier. The fact, for example, those string quartets with that new recording that's just come out, which is so great. But let's see, that was written in 1983, that piece, and there was one string quartet that really could play it for 20 years. The Arditi String Quartet, for whom it was written, and the Kronos Quartet played it a couple times and gave up. I mean, they played it, but they really didn't. It wasn't part of the repertoire, and really nobody else played it. But then, and somebody had mentioned this, and we had the Sound Axis Festival that David was involved in 2006 in Toronto, and there. And Penderecki String Quartet, which is a local group in Canada, and they played that piece, and I was actually kind of reticent. I was wondering whether they could play it. Like, oh, this could be really bad, and Francois Xenakis was there, and it was like, oh, this could be not good for us, showing off how really not quite up to par we are. But yet they gave the most amazing performance, and Francois felt the same. It was mind-blowing, and they played it really well. And of course now there's the Jack Quartet here, and so those things move on. There was a period when a lot of his pieces, especially the solo and chamber pieces, extremely virtuosic, but then you have the Robert Black, you have the Arditi Quartet, you have Yuji Takahashi, and so forth, and yes, and a number of people who have taken it on, and they played it as if it was music, as if and in the case of the Arditi Quartet, like literally played tetras probably at least 500 times, probably more like 1,000 times. It's part of the repertoire, and other people hear that, see them do it, and, well, obviously it's possible because they do it, and they're not doing it as if, it's torture or as if it was the most excruciating thing that they could do. They play it as if it's music and it's part of their thing, and so that moves it along. what's regrettable, I would say, certainly in North America, we do have people like Stephen Schick and the Jack Quartet and this Penderecki Quartet, etc. But he's got 50 pieces for orchestra, right? And when are they played? They're not more difficult than other pieces that orchestras play. Mahler's difficult to play. The Xenakis pieces are amazing to hear, those orchestra pieces, because it's an acoustical energy. It's a performance of energy and acoustics, and phenomenal to hear live. It's almost doesn't happen in North America, and it doesn't happen a whole lot more anywhere else. Which is we do have recordings of a lot of the pieces that are out now, which is great. But you have to hear them live. You really have to hear them live. Those pieces that are intended for musicians. Actually, even we've had some discussion about the electroacoustic pieces too, and multi-channel electroacoustic pieces have to be heard live. It's not the same to hear stereo mix coming out of a stereo, off a CD. So we need to do more, I think, and there is work going on, ongoing work to try and keep that going and, present those things. And I know that there are events coming up. We should plug like that.
The Jack concert.
Yeah. Yes, and the electroacoustic concert.
February 6th.
Yes. So.
In Los Angeles, too, and the show, the exhibit travel to Los Angeles, there's some plans to, sorry. In Los Angeles, also, there's some plans to do with all of the electroacoustic pieces. David Rosenboom, I think, is organizing something out of CalArts, as last I heard. So,
as well as in Montreal, because before LA, we go to Montreal with the show also, and we're trying to be as ambitious as possible in our public programming there as well.
I want to continue this thought. I love you sort of said it sort of tongue in cheek as if it was music about the ability to play this stuff. It's so interesting. We talk so much about Xenakis, the innovator, and all these new sounds that he did. The idea that there'd be an orchestra piece, I would contend it probably is harder than Mahler, because some of these orchestra pieces, every single member of the orchestra has a separate part. So, imagine the nightmare for the librarian who has to, run around distributing these parts. And a lot of the scores are on very large-sized paper. The materials are unwieldy. There are things that need to be done. Of course, all of these things can be overcome. The aspect of Xenakis I want to focus in on is sort of the exact opposite of that. The fact in some ways that he was very traditional. He wrote string quartets. He wrote 50 pieces for orchestra. We talk about, the orchestra, the future of the orchestra. So many younger composers don't even deal with the orchestra for a variety of reasons, whether it's political or the fact that it's so impossible to get a piece of music played by an orchestra. But he believed in the orchestra. He wrote solo piano music. He wrote solo harpsichord music, for God's sakes. It's not only, traditional, or taking the tradition even further back, and to turn it over to Carl as somebody, the self-proclaimed outsider to music in this. I want to call him on that. Xenakis is very much a part and parcel of what we call contemporary classical music. I'm curious how you, as a professed non-musician, came to love this music. How did you discover it, and why do you love it? And how did that happen? And you need a microphone, but you're not getting mine. I get that one.
Don't get me started. There's forget the that's a different story. I'm not a musician. But I'm acoustically hypersensitive. And so, for instance, in the first session when Victoria Myers was talking about how difficult Michael Schumacher's music was, I made a bit of a hash of trying to counter that with how grateful I was that finally somebody made music that would make sense to somebody that's used to listening as, to echolocating as they move through buildings and down to the subway and back out and, and get home. There are people I love I can't be in certain rooms with just because of how it works. And the Oresteia was a revelation partly because he actually built an independent architectural space that I felt as a three-dimensional space inside of the Miller Theater. And all of the, the piety about him being able to do that was all of a sudden, it's like, oh, this really works. But I have a very different stake in Xenakis, actually, in my day job, insofar as the as I've described this fantastic experience of moving from the hallway into the bathroom musically. The most impoverished, and I'm going to take Jim up on this, the least satisfying acoustic experience I can have is canned music. It's like the iPod is the worst thing that can happen to me, and so that Xenakis didn't write for CD, we're on the same page. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there's all these people running around with more and more canned music, and it's more and more boiled and more reduced. I mean, by the time it's an MP3 coming out of laptop speakers, it's not going to get worse than that. I don't think. I hope.
Don't ever underestimate the power of technology to make things even worse.
Well, this is the thing, and then there we compel. It's now obligatory. You don't have to have health insurance, but you have to have a computer. Okay, I'm Canadian, and I didn't have to have a computer at a certain point. So
and you had health insurance
and stuff, and so that thing, right, that you now have, it's like, okay, people, that they spent the money for the piano on that goddamn thing, so it had better do for them what a piano can do, not a cheap transistor radio. And so the business of making the logic available to people immediately, so to speak, so that they can make their own now, is just so fundamental. And the cross-media thing is less important to me than this meta-art question. It's like making sense of the underlying logic so that people can build their own music, so they don't have to suck it out of cans. I mean, that's what Xenakis is doing for me, besides La Tourette being a really great place to be acoustically hypersensitive.
Well, I want to hear about this sequencer that you built and how that comes out of Xenakis. I missed the talk on it, but if you could just kind of connect that to this somehow.
Okay. Well, when I went to the La Tourette forum, there was this goofy experience of trying to watch PowerPoint in that place, which is insane, and this, these windows, and it's like, that looks like the graphical sequencer interface with which I could explain to Max Appelbaum what the heck syncopation is and give him enough control of it right now to get value out of that, precisely so that he's not getting out of cans without knowing, what a can is. And the business, and as the touchscreens come on, and just the elegance of this particular window, it's like, boy, oh boy, if I had 10 fingers and an idea what to do with those things that fast, the business that Stefan was talking about in a much more, thorough way built on his own experience, it's like, I can get started with that, and so can a bunch of people I know who have a right to, and have the means to that supplanted the means to the access they used to have. So bring it on.
I think Carl brings up a really good point, and kind of highlights what I think is it may sound really mundane to say, but Yannis's incredible originality on every single level, on every single discipline that he touched, is something that I find very inspiring, and I'm glad Carl did, because I think we have a new toy to play with that really works. Because here in the realization of undulating glass panes, a purely architectural realization that actually, as you mentioned, Frank, is derived from sort of probabilistic speculations when he was working on Pithopracta at more or less the same time. But I think one also has to be extremely careful to not get lazy and base one's translations too literally. And I was telling Hans Christoph before, sometimes I could get angry, even though I think it's a beautiful instrument, at Yannis for creating the U-pick, because the Yupik, where the hand draws the sound that we can see. In a way, it's a pity that we can see it. I don't think it was ever intended to be seen. It was intended as a private tool for himself. The same way Benoit's beautiful paper on the arborescences that he drew freehand, they were his sketches. If he translated them more or less literally, these were his sketches. When he was doing his multimedia arts, and if we can consider him a pioneer in the new media arts, what he brought to that stage, and that a beautiful lesson we can learn, is that the mind is capable of much more than one thing at a time. And if we're going to go for literal translations all the time between glissandi and hyperbolic paraboloids, we can go much further than that. And all of his 5 polytopes were adamantly pioneers of several levels of meaning and several levels of articulation at the same time. Even with the first polytope in Montreal, he was calculating what is the fastest vision, 1/25th of a second, so that he could simulate cinematic movement with individual lights, and under that, a very calm music that he certainly didn't want to have the literal translation of these lights with music. That would be a pleonasm. It's totally boring, and he was adamantly opposed to that. And yet, there can be literal translations when you're changing media, I think, like from the Windows to a software that later can be manipulated on several levels and have a personal intervention on behalf of a composer, another creative person.
Yeah, porting works. But to go further with another aspect of what you're saying, something that we didn't tie in with Xenakis as a role model for everybody, and I wonder different people's takes on this, is the whole question of the composer or the artist, to take it beyond the compositional level. The artist as politician, the artist as citizen, the artist as an effectuator, potential effectuator of social change. This is a man who was slated to be executed. This was a man who had very, very strong political beliefs, had to flee both the land where he was born and the land where where his parents were from, where he studied in Greece, lived in exile in France for years and years and years, decades. And when he finally went home, finally had his epiphany with returning to Greece, it brought out some incredibly emotional music from him, works like the Oresteia, all these other works. But what does it mean when you write, say, a piece for orchestra in which everybody has their own part? Well, that really is about everybody being an individual. There is a political message in a piece like that. So, when we talk about these pieces and the fact that they're not getting done as much as we want them to, not only are they not getting done, but perhaps the messages that he was hoping these pieces engendered are not getting across. And how does that, to the composers and the artists on this stage here, how does that play out in your own work, and how has Xenakis been a role model for you there?
All right, I'll give this a shot. One of the things that always interested me about Xenakis was what, even if I knew an incredibly simplified version of it, his sort of life narrative. And a lot of his music is about numbers, yeah, but it's about data. But I think a lot of what he's doing is about the political act of not confusing, I call it confusing knowledge with experience. Right? So if you're working with sort of masses of instrumental forces or masses of sound or whatever, it sounds like war, right? It works like war, and the mechanism of it sort of has that kind of thing to it. And as a result, he was, in a way, that's actually what is the emotional magnificence of a lot of his work is precisely that, because you know about him, right? That you get hit with this idea that maybe this is what this sounded like, to him. I talked about it for a second in my talk, but I did a string quartet called Hard Data, where I used the Iraq War casualty stream to try to make sound, and it was a double meaning in the title, right? Because it's hard data, like it's facts, but it's hard data because it's devastating data, right? It's hard, it's unbearable data, and what is the weight of a note when you know what the note signifies? Right, and so what is the weight of Xenakis' procedures when you know where they're coming from, when you know that they're coming from an emotional place, given the sort of paradox that in composition class you're taught or you're told that he was a really abstract guy, right? You're sort of your understanding, your sort of blank understanding of stochastic music is very much about equations and math, and you read formalized music, and formalized music is very much about dealing with a system and figuring all that out. It's like a systems kind of thing, but it resonated, for him, and so you have to find a system that resonates for you, right? And so that's what I always, sort of encourage people who are interested in him to sort of figure out is,
Yeah.
Well, when you think about Xenakis, the first thing that strikes me is he's a systems kind of oriented person. And the idea of systems here is that they evoke kinds of data frame sets. I mean, that's what, if you look at information theory, it's one of the main, sort of glue holding together our information economy. Claude Shannon and Norbert Weiner, he has a great book called, he coined the term cybernetics. So when you look at cybernetics, it's about manipulation of information. But noise is deeply complex. And one of the things that Xenakis, I think, really was able to give a systemic structure to was noise and the idea of very, very complex acoustic data. But if you look at, say, for example, another group of people that engage noise, the Italian futurists, Luigi Russolo is one of my favorite writers, but if you look at the political aspect of what him and Marinetti were up to, it's this is so you can really see that these kinds of interpretive frames can be people can run with noise in several directions. I mean, so when in 1915, when Luigi Russolo wrote The Art of Noise, World War I's going on, you have massive amount of political turbulence. All sorts of stuff comes out of that. If you look at George Hantil with Ballet Mécanique afterwards, or the rise of the Surrealists, all these people responded to the war. After the war, they came home and ended up creating Dada, or ended up creating wild, noise symphonies or something. He's coming out of World War II, which is even more kind of a process of collision of politics. But the funny thing with Greece is that the U.S. set up a whole system of right-wing, militias in all these countries that we occupied. If you look at Japan, for example, the Democratic Liberal Party was finally voted out of office just last year after World War II, 50 years in power. The Greeks had when he was sentenced to death, you have to remember he was a leftist, he was a progressivist, and above all, he was an idealist. He really stuck by. It's very rare that you get the political dimension of his work. A lot of times people just focus on the mathematical kind of issues. But in my own work, as a response to that, when I ended up working with him for the Cronberg piece, he flew to New York, presided over it, and we ended up getting into some wild conversations about politics and in the U.S. and the kind of dimension that he had been actually kind of put through from the U.S. intervention in Greeks. So to make a long story short, if you fast forward to 2009, I took a studio down to Antarctica and basically went to several of the main ice fields and did these acoustic portraits of different kinds of ice. So with my own work and when I'm looking at Luke's, both of us take this idea of noise and complexity and sort of systems. But I think that, probably the two composers that really influenced my work on that are Xenakis and Varese, mainly from Varese because he's one of the first composers to look very deeply at percussion. But above all, with the way Xenakis was able to apply this sort of cybernetic take on it. And right now, one of the main themes that seems to be going on is cyber war. Everyone's looking at, hackers. Google's just got hacked by Chinese hackers in, Beijing. So what will the music that comes out of that be? I'm really intrigued how these kinds of military industrial situations, he would have been an insurgent in Iraq, or something. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's so weird. All these things we're talking about, he basically died at the very beginning of the 21st century, and all the things that are playing out now, he's not around to see. Certainly he lived through some of the worst horrors of history, living through Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and the repercussions after the war. But it would be very interesting to see what his take it was politically on what's going on now.
Especially because he worked with Iran, the Shah, when they presented Persepolis right before the fall of the Shah. I mean, that must have been super wild to be presenting this crazy high-tech laser show. Meanwhile, Muslim Ayatollah, he could be like, oh, that's a familiar picture. I mean, I think that we always have to factor that in. That's all. If you think about this, this MacGuffin, the UNESCO program, and that manifesto that he lays out, and you think, okay, let's see, that's 1964. And that's about the time where he would start to feel like he had something to teach, I think, just in terms of having matured as a composer. And, you would get to that point. And that the very specific item about the business of giving access to the deep structure on a global scale of different musics. Because, that's, in a way, the ultimate progressivist agenda from the point of view of this meta-art logic is that everybody has a right to the underlying logics, that's a program, and it's a political program. And it's pan-humanist. I definitely think of him as a pan-humanist composer because, from what I remember reading a couple of years ago, he'd even done a series of analytic mathematical models of different tuning systems of different cultures as well, and was trying to figure out some stuff with that. Maybe that's something that Sharon could riff on a little bit, his relationship to other cultures.
He was indeed fascinated. Françoise loves telling this story, how when they were young and poor and starting out in Paris, every Sunday they would go climb the back stairs of the Natural History Museum. And there was a musicologist whose name escapes me now. I'm sorry if I could find it. And anybody who really needs to know, I could send it to you. An ethnomusicologist, and they would spend Sundays, the whole day, listening to music from Java, from Balinese music. And he took a memorable trip, I think, do you remember when they went? 62? 62 with Maurice Fleuret, who is a very, very close friend of theirs and who is the main music critic at the time of Nouvel Observateur, which is kind of like New Yorker magazine. And they did an extensive trip precisely to record and listen and bring back examples of as much music as they could, Javanese music. And they were in Bali and they were a little bit all over. Maybe you remember better.
I think in Philippines and in Indonesia, yeah. And actually, to connect to that, when he was in Paris, I'm not sure about Indiana, but when he taught for longer in Paris, and he had students, the couple examples that I can think of like a Japanese composer who was there and studied with him, and there was somebody else and she did a dissertation on traditional Japanese music, or a thesis on Japanese music that he was overseeing, and so he was encouraging that kind of thing. There was somebody else who was exploring tuning systems in China, and these had nothing to do with the teaching he did normally, but it was a master's program, and he had people doing that, and he helped them with it. And mostly what he was doing is, and this touches on some of what Charles was talking about in terms of Xenakis as a teacher, was really challenging people to pursue their ideas further. And I was going to come back to that anyway, and talking about an influence. So that would be the absolute critical thing in terms of his inspiration, is to challenge people to go further. He and behind all of the stuff he did was his background, his training in engineering. He had a technical training, heavy in mathematics, and that's behind everything that he did. So he could move fluidly all around the place, but behind everything he did was sort of a really solid sense of structure, and but also, I guess, a solid sense of structure and discipline and in thought, to be analytical and so forth. But also, I think that is what he would. Well, people have already said that. What he would advise you to do is to study mathematics, right? He never talked about his own, although maybe he did for you people. He never talked about his own music in his classes.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, he would. Yeah, you had to force him to do that, and occasionally he would, and it was always interesting. But really, it was important for the discipline of thought to be studying mathematics as being kind of the abstraction that would be behind everything you might choose to do. And I think that's really important to remember. That informs him as a designer, as an architect, as as a composer, as everything. But what made him maybe really unusual is that combination of that kind of background and really intense creative impulse.
I would love to open it up to the audience for some questions, but I had one other thought that I wanted to extend on that I've been thinking about this a lot over the course of the day. That on the one hand, we keep talking about the future, and the whole point of this discussion was the future of Xenakis, but at the same time that he was such a channeler of the future, he was also so respectful of the past, whether it's using a harpsichord or writing a solo piano piece dedicated to Ravel. I mean, there's a solo piano piece dedicated to Ravel by Xenakis. That's amazing. Or going back to the earliest times, to the ancient Greeks, he's very much aware of history. He never lets history go. And I think, no matter what our future is, we have to, if there's a lesson that I learned from Xenakis, it's that we have to be always mindful and respectful of our history as we shape our future.
Absolutely, Frank. That opens a huge other chapter. I think the whole Hellenism of Giannis, and Benoit should be here to participate in that. But I just wanted to go back one step again when I was talking about originality and his personal quest for originality and his inspiration for one to pursue one's own originality. And it's interesting, and I think I addressed it in the article. I mean, it was so edited. The article that I wrote for the catalog, in the Drawing Center catalog, about, because for me, the exhibit, going back to that also, is about his creative process and different manifestations that can be. And it can be purely graphical, it can be computer readouts, it could be intellectual musings, words, all sorts of things. And this, and actually in the book Music and Architecture, we chose together the little epigraph at the beginning, which is l'originalité est une nécessité absolue pour la civilisation. So originality is an absolute necessity for the pursuit of civilization. Without that, we kind of atrophy, I think. And this, from Giannis's point of view, could be done in two ways, and they are interrelated. One is through rationalization, and the other one is through intuition, following one's intuitions. And Benoit talking about the arborescence and these finally freehand drawings that he started developing after very, very systematized procedures. The fact of drawing enabled him to take that little step back to observe his intuitions in order to try to rationalize them again, to go beyond. Once he could visualize them, then this would enable him to go beyond them. This constant quest for going beyond, of self-surpassment or of going beyond one's own ideas also, and to always push further. I think that's really a very important Xenakian legacy.
We don't have a lot of time, but I did see a hand over there. Yeah, and we have floating microphone. We want to hold the microphone so that it gets recorded. Yeah.
Pretty loud voice, but
okay.
Well, as you could tell, I come mostly from the world of performance and performance studies, and I'm very, very interested. But I'm also a musician. I'm very interested in the intersection between electronic music and more stuff that's more traditionally related with performance, and some obvious entry points are obviously like the Futurists or Laurie Anderson or Toe or so on and so forth. But I've never really thought of Xenakis as kind of in that same sort of lineage, unless you think kind of abstractly about the performativity of tape music and stuff like that. But when Paul was talking about cybernetics, that seems to be sort of an interesting entry point to things, because in performance studies, there's a lot of talk about cyborgs and cybernetics, and particularly, the Cyborg Manifesto with Donna Haraway. So I was wondering if anyone can kind of riff on that idea of just where, Xenakis kind of comes in as a way to think about performance. So.
Yeah, I mean, with Kroner, actually the conductor, Charles Bornstein's here. He conducted it in 1996. With Kroner, you have to remember it was meant to be a dance piece. And some of my favorite moments from Xenakis, the performative aspects, dispersing the musicians throughout the audience, or creating a kind of a very uneasy tension between the tonal structures of something like Kroner, the tape loops, the dancers' movements. There's some stunning pictures online. If you look up, if you just type Google dance plus Xenakis or something, you'll see some really interesting interpretations of his material. Yeah, that's something that gets left out of a lot of the idea of high, culture in Europe. Like Stravinsky, for example, everyone tends to forget most of his music was made for dance. And so when you look at Xenakis, these rhythms and the way that they kind of engage the body, I really think of his stuff as trying to spatialize human experience. We've had a couple centuries of the proscenium space of the stage, and that was something that's very problematic in the 20th versus 21st century, where the stage is now dispersed throughout the internet. You can download, upload. Frank, before we got on stage, you said that everything's recorded. We're in the perpetual present. So if you missed this speech, we'll probably all be online, right? And just download and remix as you feel, as you desire. But at the end of the day, the way that we live now with this degree of comfort with recordings of all aspects of almost every notion of experience is how we consume media. We live in a world of recordings. In fact, I visited YouTube's corporate headquarters a while ago, and there's more video being up. Yeah, it's a long story, but there's more video being uploaded every hour than the bulk of humanity could actually live. So they have these huge data farming servers outside. They have to even place their data farms near rivers just to be able to keep the data sets cool. Literally, they'll take cooling water and so on. It's a long story, but how much data we generate, that's something that's very Xenakian. I mean, it's one of the, but again, just to riff on what both my colleagues were saying, if you go back to ancient Greek stuff, the idea, being in Antarctica, for example, which is one of the most remote places on Earth, I was there for 4 weeks, and I was like, how did the Greeks name this place? They'd never been, and they'd never seen ice, and if you look at Arctos, it just means the bear, which there was a constellation in the north, so they named the Arctic, because it was facing this one little constellation of stars. It's amazing. So when they called Antarctos, which means just opposite of the bear, the Greeks barely had any relationship to Antarctica whatsoever. It was like, how did this culture come up with all of these amazing layers of representation and lyricism? I mean, even Pythagoras, for example, you weren't allowed to speak to him. You had to kind of talk to him through a veil, and they would whisper algorithms through this veil. And if you gave away the secret of -1, the square root of -1, which was considered a kind of a mystery, or a kind of a holy mystery, you could be assassinated. You weren't allowed to ever reveal the secrets of these numbers. Yeah, so I mean, the Greeks were pretty heavy with this kind of stuff, and theater, comedy, tragedy, all this kind of weird. The Egyptians had, some of the first notated music. We can look back and see some really amazing music notation systems, and coming out of Iran as well, during the time of Babylon or something. But it's hard to imagine what it would have sounded like. Xenakis makes you feel like you're in some ancient, weird Greek theater, hearing crazy, people with masks pronouncing the voices of gods or something, Anyway, that's the performance. I mean, it's pretty, right. When you see one of his pieces, you feel that.
And I definitely kind of feel, I think someone used the phrase Hellenistic when described, and I definitely do see that kind of relationship to, ancient stuff from antiquity in terms of having that mathematical basis, but also having sort of that grotesque irrationality that's so, related to that moment.
I think we only have time. I'm sorry, we only have time for one more question from the audience, but people can come up to people. I know that they have to get ready for a concert that they're doing, but maybe one more question from somebody else. Yeah, go for it.
I hadn't heard thus far. I'd only been here today. I wasn't here yesterday or the day before, but I get this very strong feeling that Xenakis is a true inspiration to creators, the creative process, intellectual virtuosity, scientific fluency, all these things that stimulate and nourish the creators and the thinkers. And what I would like to know from those that knew him personally or had met him, did he have any connection to views on the audience as a concept of receptivity? Did he care about the audience? Was he interested in audience accessibility to what he created?
Jim?
Françoise always loves to tell the story that, he was always very eager to go to dress rehearsals, but when it was time to go to the concert, he would always say, do I have to? No, I don't think he was preoccupied. And actually, there's a very informative interview in the DVD that Maud produced of La Légendaire and the Diatope. There's a 45-minute interview between Janis and Halbreich. And it's quite revelatory in that he's speaking to young students, and they tend to be, though they were in Paris at the CCMX, I think they were all American students. And so he answers in English, and the questions are in English. And I remember one of the kids saying, but, I'm going to have to make a living. I want to be a composer, and, I can't just do what I want to do because nobody will buy it and everything else. And I think it's... Janis will answer the question if you listen to that. He said, if you're concerned with that, then don't be a composer. If you're worried about how you're going to make your living, then choose another profession.
And I think it's important too that survival seems to always be in the quotient of this. And I was hoping that Paul would grab the mic because I think that having a relationship to popular culture in the sense of how to reach people in the way that you're integrating an intellectual background or what's called serious music and popular music. I think there's a very important link there that you've succeeded in achieving. And
well, I think in Yiddish you just say "oy vey," I have to do a lot of translation between scenes and styles. Luke, you can probably riff on this one as well. But when you look at the arc of the last century, it's really amazing, the rear view mirror, the 20th century, it's all these cultures were coexistent. Everybody, James Brown, it's amazing. You can imagine him dancing around and like JFK watching it on TV or something, it's just like, or we're here in New York and Philip Glass, I can't imagine he's never met Africa Bambaataa. I know both of them, they haven't met one another. But it's a funny thing because when I met Xenakis with the Cronach piece, he was very inquisitive, and during the rehearsal, he liked to walk through the room and kind of hear the piece from radically different angles in the room. We did it at the Cooper Union Hall, which is where President Lincoln gave his major speech during his, kind of announcing all this stuff. So it was a hall that had a lot of history, but anyone who's ever seen a concert at Cooper Union can always avow there's these annoying columns right in the middle. So he would like to kind of go and stand behind the column so we couldn't see it, but he just kind of would linger around. And there's these weird columns right in the middle. They block your view. You can't. So we'd see, where'd he go? And then you realize he was like listening behind the column. So the orchestra was on the stage and we couldn't see him. Then we'd see him sort of like lean out a little bit and then walk around to another one, and just kind of constantly moving. And we rehearsed for it was several days, right? Like about maybe under a week or something. So every day, just kind of, and it's a piece with I think something like 70 cues for the tape. And he knew the exact, by mnemonic. I mean, literally every moment, just like we'd stop and we'd ask him, was that the right entry point? And he'd go, yeah. And then he'd walk around, go hide behind another column a little bit. and like lean out a little bit and then come back. You know, it was kind of like a little bird hovering around. It was very, it's just a very, very charming and very warm-hearted person, and always a sort of a ready smile. You know, it's kind of. And anyone out there who's a young artist or composer, if you ever meet like a cranky older person, he wasn't like a cranky older artist, you know, because there's lots of those too. But he was.
Oh yeah.
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 The architecture.
Last word.
Maybe a last word is the capacity of architecture to contain and to engage, and its opportunity that it offers all of those who have been speaking in this panel, and perhaps most in the room. And I'd like to refer to the poet Anne Carson, and classical scholar, who in Eros the Bittersweet recounts the tale of before the Greeks there were no vowels in language. And with the Greek language, the sound of the vowel is bounded by the consonant. And in that same way, as Jim spoke of the necessity of performance of Xenakis, of live performance, be it electronic or acoustic in terms of music, be it the visual or the tactile, it is that necessity of the containment, of the bounding, of the limits of space, and it is historically referential, it is Hellenistic, but it promises an extraordinary future. And I think we should all be giving a vote of thanks, not just to the conveners of this, but to Yanis Xenakis for an extraordinary future that lays ahead of us all.
Those are great words to end on. Thank you. This is a great panel, and stick around for the concert. And